I'll now ask the live stream be started. Thank you. Confirmation the live stream has been started.
It is, we are live.
Thank you. So welcome to this meeting of Adults and Wellbeing Scrutiny Committee being held on Monday, the 1st of November 2021. For those present in the meeting room, if fire alarm sounds, please leave the building by the nearest exit and proceed to the assembly area in the car park. The agenda papers and other relevant information for this meeting are available for public viewing on the Herefordshire Council website. The Council is streaming this meeting live on the Herefordshire Council YouTube channel and is making a recording. To ensure that recording quality is maintained, please speak as clearly as possible and keep background noise to a minimum. Please ensure that mobile phones and other devices are turned to silent. Others are permitted to film, photograph and record our public meetings, provided it does not disrupt the business of the meeting. If there are any members of the public present who do not wish to be filmed or photographed, please raise your hand so that any such person filming or photographing may be made aware. Voting will be undertaken by a show of hands in the room. Only committee members present may vote. We have a number of people in attendance as virtual participants, and I welcome them to the meeting. Can I request that they use the raise hand function within the system when they wish to contribute? And if they could introduce themselves when they come to speak, that would be very helpful. I'm going to take a moment now just to pass over to the Vice Chair, Councillor Trish Marsh.
Hello, yes, yesterday I was belatedly swapping my summer clothes to my winter clothes, and I came across this T-shirt, which is a 1993 T-shirt from when I attended the third National Environmental Coordinators Conference in Glasgow, when I just started working for Hereford City in 1993, and it just reminded me both of how far we've come and how far we've not come. And being very aware that today is the first day of COP, I thought that it would be worth just spending a moment, because a World Health Organization report has just come out a few days ago explaining that climate change is the biggest single health issue for adults, and therefore I feel cannot be not of interest to this committee. And this council, of course, has worked on this issue for a long time and unanimously agreed to declare a climate emergency in 2018. We've got bold plans. We've even got the banner up on the website, finally, after some time. So there now is genuinely a lot of good information easily available for the public. And there's so much we can do, which would help adult health, to do with insulating homes, supporting active travel. And yes, we're ready to go, really. We're doing what we can ourselves. We're ready to work with government. We're ready to work with businesses, and a climate change board will be starting shortly. And of course, we're ready to work with citizens. And because it is such a huge health impact, it's somewhat difficult to take in. There were some very interesting figures, well, distressing figures I was reading about the impact of flooding, for instance, on mental health, which is certainly something that our own county would understand about. And as we have so many elderly people and so many poorly insulated homes, we are also more open to the health impacts of extreme heat or extreme cold. So really, I'm just sort of sending, as it were, sending the love to COP21, to the delegates, to the lobbyists, to everyone there, including our own councillor, Ellie Chowns, and wishing Prince Charles and Boris and anyone else of goodwill a chance for a good outcome, which will support all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Marsh. And I think I'm sure we all second those sentiments, and we wish all the best to those attending COP26 and hope for the right outcome. Thank you. So we'll get on now with our agenda today. Agenda item number 1, apologies for absence. Have any apologies been notified to the clerk?
I've had apologies from Councillor Gandy, and I'll give apologies from Councillor Selden as well, who's away.
Thank you, and I take it we have no name substitutes.
I'm not aware of any, Chair.
Thank you. Questions from members of the public. We have no questions from members of the public. Questions from councillors. We have no questions from councillors for this meeting. So agenda item number 7 is the draft domestic abuse.
Point of order, have we not missed 3 and 4?
Oh, I do apologise. Yes, sorry. I going a little bit too quickly.
So excited.
Helping along.
Yes, okay, so agenda item number 3, declarations of interest. Do any members wish to declare in Schedule 1, Schedule 2 or other interests? No, thank you. And then, agenda item number 4, minutes. The minutes of the meeting held on the 6th of September are included in the agenda at pages 9 to 11 for approval. Councillor Marsh has notified me of an amendment that she would like to make. Councillor Marsh.
Yes, I was proposing that to do with the out of hospital thing, that we inserted a sentence that said, as the expected report was not available, the committee focused on the continuing healthcare, which was really just to know that there seemed to be, yes, not quite what we
Did
were
you explain the
expecting.
discrepancy between
The heading.
the heading of the agenda item and the substance of the discussion? So I move that the minutes subject to that amendment, if agreed, is signed as a correct record. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. Councillor Price. Okay. Thank you. Any against? Any abstentions? Thank you. So agenda item number 5. Members of the public. There are no questions from members of the public. Agenda item 6, questions from councillors. There are no questions from councillors. Agenda item number 7, draft domestic abuse strategy. So our substantive item this afternoon is to consider the attached draft domestic abuse strategy and to determine any recommendations the committee wishes to make. I'm very pleased to welcome staff from West Mercia Women's Aid who have kindly given up their valuable time this afternoon to share their perspectives, both personal and professional, on the issue of domestic abuse. I will hand over to Paul Smith, Director of Adults and Communities, to introduce the item. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The draft strategy in front of scrutiny today is as a result of new legislation that came into place in 2021, in April 2021. The revised strategy does take us beyond the term of the existing strategy and requires us to make a number of changes to our existing approach to domestic abuse within the county. We are joined today by West Mercia Women's Aid, which is very welcome. Appreciate that support, and we have worked in collaboration with the organisation extensively during the process. There will be, assuming that this proposal is approved and supported, there will be extensive engagement with stakeholders between November and January of next year, and Cabinet will consider a final revised strategy in March 22. I can confirm that the statutory guidance in relation to these changes, although the law was indicated in April 21, that the guidance associated with these changes only actually arrived a few weeks ago. So we have been working somewhat in anticipation of the guidance, but the guidance did arrive and thankfully did confirm most of what was indicated in the initial draft from government. So certainly that was incredibly useful, but it did prove quite difficult to interpret without the guidance. We have made a number of changes in terms of the document that is in front of councillors today. I can go through those in detail, but if you would prefer, I'd like to hear from West Mercia Women's Aid, and then we can go through the changes that the document proposes, and then of course have an extensive questions and answer session which will form the bulk of today's agenda.
Thank you. It's my preference that we hear from West Mercia Women's Aid first, and then also they're free to get back to important work if they don't wish to stay for the full debate, so that we have a natural break there, if that's agreeable to everyone. Councillor Summers.
I'm just concerned about the changes that we need a copy of those anyway, so when can we expect it?
Sorry, Councillor.
The changes that you're making.
I have a document with me today that describes the changes in summary. I could distribute that to councillors if you wish this afternoon, actually. But
yeah, I would like to know them, and we will be getting a hard copy later to.
Yes,
for our records?
the
'Cause-
changes are within the draft that is before you today,
Oh, okay,
but I do have a summary of them which might prove useful for council.
thank you.
That's something really useful, at some point, thank you, yeah. So, we could proceed with, presentation from the West Mercia Women's Aid, that would be very, very good, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name's Sue Coleman. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of West Mercia Women's Aid, and I'm joined today by my colleague Catherine Howarth, who works for West Mercia Women's Aid, but is also here and can talk from the perspective of a survivor of domestic abuse. As Paul has said, West Mercia Women's Aid has worked closely as part of a multi-agency group in reviewing the domestic abuse strategy for Herefordshire, in order to recognise the imperatives that have come with the passing of the Domestic Abuse Act in 2021, and to accommodate those so that the authority is compliant with that legislation. I'd just like to reflect, first of all, that that the Domestic Abuse Act was designed in order to ensure that all local authorities had in place sufficient and appropriate services for the victims of domestic abuse. That's across the whole of the UK. Some authorities will have needed that particular prod in legislation. Herefordshire is not one of them. Herefordshire has been supporting domestic abuse services for some considerable time. I've been here for 5 years now, and I know that the work that I inherited from my predecessor was already very well supported by Herefordshire Council. So to some extent, that imperative, that drive that's come with the Domestic Abuse Act is more relevant for other councils than for Herefordshire. But within that legislation, there have been particular aspects highlighted that I think that are reflected now in the strategy. The first is that there's particular emphasis in the legislation on the importance of having adequate, safe, secure accommodation for those victims of domestic abuse that need to flee and need somewhere safe to go. And in anticipation of this, actually, over the last 18 months, we've been working very closely with Herefordshire Council and with Connexus Housing Association to identify additional properties that could be used as satellite properties to our refuge in Hereford. Councillors may not know that the refuge in Herefordshire is new. It's been in place now, I think, for about 3 years. It replaced an older building, an older and very well used building, but this is a new build of what I would consider to be the highest spec that you would find for a refuge, with each family having its own self-contained accommodation, as well as some shared facilities so that they can operate as a community. But that refuge is about as good as it gets for refuges across the country, and we're incredibly proud of it. We do find that all those that have stayed in that refuge thus far have really been appreciative of the quality of the services that provides for them. Obviously, because that accommodation is self-contained, and because we now have a range of other satellite properties that Connexus have provided, and where we provide support to the families in those properties, we've got that kind of blended approach, which means that those that need a particular kind of support, or that would rather not be in any kind of communal property, can be accommodated. We've got some flexibility, and we can allow people some choice with that accommodation, and that's only right for those that are fleeing domestic abuse. So Herefordshire is pretty well served already as far as accommodation is concerned. The other, for me, most important aspect of the legislation as far as providing local services is concerned is the recognition that children should also be regarded as the victims of domestic abuse when they are from families where domestic abuse has occurred, and that authorities should therefore ensure that they are providing services to support those children. And again, Herefordshire has already got quite a clear focus on the importance of supporting children where there's been domestic abuse in the family. and last year set up a domestic abuse hub, which my organisation has been supporting since its inception. So we work very closely with children's services to try to ensure that all children that have been impacted upon by the abuse in their household, in their family, get the support that they need as and when they need it. So Herefordshire's already been a bit ahead of the curve. There's always more work that can be done, and the domestic abuse strategy highlights a range of different elements of work that Herefordshire wants to tackle and take on board. But from our perspective, we're reassured that we're closely involved in supporting that and in ensuring that where it's appropriate for our services to provide the service that Herefordshire wants, that we're in a position to deliver that with the kind of quality that the residents of Herefordshire deserve. I'm joined by my colleague, Catherine. I don't know if it's appropriate for the meeting if I ask Catherine to speak now. Catherine can talk from the perspective of someone who has used our services in the past and who is now an important part of the delivery of those services as well. And I'm very grateful to Catherine for being prepared to come and talk about her own experience and to draw from that some of her reflections on what current provision looks like and what provision could look like in the future.
Thank you, Sue. That would be really fantastic. I think the committee would really appreciate the chance of being able to listen to Catherine's perspective. Thank you very much.
Oh, hi. So I'm Catherine, and as Sue has introduced me, I am a survivor of domestic abuse. I now work for Women's Aid as a family court IDFA. So my role there is to assist people with family court and civil orders. So assisting people get non-molestation orders, not creation orders, helping them with child arrangements and prohibited steps. So all quite legal, but that makes sense because I'm a qualified solicitor as a background. So so I wanted to join the organisation in a way that I could give more and help, which is good. And so I don't know how much my experience will or won't help what you're doing as a committee, but I've got quite a different story because to a lot of people, I guess. And I've got areas where a lot of the services worked really, really well. And then some areas where I kind of feel that actually perhaps the service could improve. So my abuse in particular was more emotional than anything else. Very, very minor physical, so there wasn't really much in terms of physical violence, but mainly emotional, not financial for me because I had quite a good career at the time, and but yeah, so some sexual as well. So that was sort of where I was coming from, and I guess being a solicitor, it kind of wasn't really something that you would speak up quite openly about, because especially in your role, people see you as quite a strong person, an independent person. So, people didn't really tend to ask questions, I guess, about it. And I think it's really important to remember that, especially in Herefordshire, you're in a rural community. So my perpetrator was very well known. He had his own business and played on lots of cricket teams, quite a lot for charity as well, and was quite a well-known individual. So again, that very much limits your availability to contact people, and he was also a farmer, so if I wanted to flee the property, his grandparents lived one house up, his parents lived two houses up, and then there were no other houses for miles, and so it's sort of, that's kind of the position that you're in. So when I first made a disclosure, the first place I actually contacted was West Mercia Women's Aid, and that was on the advice of a counsellor which I had been going to. Funnily enough, my perpetrator told me that I needed counselling because I was insane, and she actually was the one who identified it and helped me and signposted me there. A lot of people cannot afford private counselling. I was quite lucky because I can, but a lot of people cannot afford it, and especially in the role that I'm in now, I see how many people really can't afford that, and it's a problem because that's one of the ways you get signposted and get help as well. So she helped me with that. Eventually, sort of long story short, there was police involvement at one stage when he became abusive in public, and there was a bit of physical violence in public as well. And I will say that first of all, the officer who dealt with it initially, and I went in and gave a statement, I thought they were amazing. They were really understanding. They listened very carefully to what I had to say. I felt believed, I felt heard, and they went through a lot of questions. What happened after then, I feel it was a bit of a blur, in that, I got told that there wasn't enough evidence to take it forward. I completely understand that. The nature of abuse is there's never really any evidence to take anything forward, and that makes it really difficult. But I was told that he'd have a verbal warning, but I wasn't told sort of when that warning would be, what would happen afterwards. And I was sort of sent something in the post about getting an injunction, but at the time I wasn't really thinking about that, because I was just, everything had suddenly come out, all these things that nobody had heard before. And I know that they did give him a verbal warning in the end, but I had to sort of follow that up, and I got told he was given a verbal warning a week ago. So potentially in that time that a week has gone by where he's been told, he now knows I've gone to the police, but I don't know that he's been told. So there's potentially a risk, especially in Herefordshire being so small. If I'd have seen him, that could have put me at more risk. So I think that's more of a potentially a funding thing, I'm not sure, but there's not always the resource to do the follow-up and the admin to keep people informed. I think it's really important. So it's not so much an attack of the fact that you couldn't do anything, because I know that's more of a jurisdictional thing. So that's just the way it is, and if there isn't enough evidence, the CPS can't do anything, and that's just the way the law works. But I think in terms of protection, that's perhaps something I did think, well, that could have been done a little bit better. And then I never really saw whether a referral was made into Women's Aid, but doing what I do now as an IDFA, I'm pretty sure my case would have been classed as high risk, but I was never picked up by an IDFA. This is about 5 or 6 years ago, but I was never picked up by anybody. So I don't know if a referral was ever made. So I think perhaps the communication between agencies wasn't as good as it is now. I definitely think it's improved. And then the third thing I sort of thought was a bit, again, this is more of an agencies talking to each other thing, was people are always more at risk when they've left the relationship. And I mean, both in terms of their physical health and their mental health, they're always at the lowest point. So I remember being at my lowest point when I left, and I actually took an overdose of cocodamol and ended up in hospital at A&E. And I'm quite lucky to be here now. But at the time, once I'd recovered from that, I was discharged from the hospital and went straight back to work. And I remember a nurse asking me, well, do you feel you need any other support, or are you going to be okay? And I just went, I'm going to be fine. And that was all that was said about it. And I kind of think my family were there because they'd been contacted, but that was also the first that any of my family had heard of it, because I hadn't spoken to them for quite some time, because I'd been isolated in that relationship. And I think that it's important that even if the survivor is saying, oh, I'm fine, it's important that agencies are aware that this has happened and something big has happened, because even though I might not be in a position to engage with support right there and then, because it's all kind of happened quite suddenly, it's good to be aware that something, that this person is going through something. So other agencies can then keep an eye on what's happening and what's going on, and perhaps find more explorative ways to contact and things like that. So that was sort of my experience of the areas I felt that, perhaps things could have been a little bit improved, like even a GP follow-up call in a week's time, just saying, oh, we've had a notification from the hospital that this happened. Are you okay? Do you want that to be referred to our NHS Healthy Minds or whatever it might be? But there wasn't really any follow-up of any kind after that. And I'm not sure if hospital IDVAs were a thing then. Sue will probably know better than I will. But there was sort of nothing from that, I guess. So that was sort of my experience. I will say that my experience working now as an IDVA for the organisation to then, I can see already how far we've come to make these improvements already. So I am talking about things which have happened a few years ago, but I think it does demonstrate that there are areas where potentially agencies and organisations could work slightly differently or closer together, or sort of report things a little bit better between them to make sure that person's getting the full level of protection they need. I hope that's helpful in some way.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, really, that's, I think it's very helpful, and certainly we'll deeply appreciate the insight that you've been able to share with us. So thank you. I think very useful for the committee to hear directly from you. And I understand that you're happy to take some questions at this point.
Yeah, sure.
That would be fantastic. Councillor Summers.
Great listening to you. I'm really happy that Herefordshire's ahead on domestic abuse, but we're ahead of the curve, but we still have a long way to go when it comes to mental abuse. It covers all age groups, as you know. And do you have any suggestions? I know you had some trouble now. From what I understand, it's cost has a lot to do with people not looking for help. The other thing is, when you were in the hospital, you should have had that help after. I think now it's been mandated. So perhaps, I'm not sure if you've heard of that yet, but if you haven't, then perhaps we should make sure that everybody hears about it, because it is mandated now, the help after mental health. I am very concerned about the mental abuse aspect of mental health, the mental abuse aspect of this. So I would really like to hear more from you in the future. I'd like to see what you think, how we're going with mental health abuse, if we are covering it as much as we could. I also would like to know if you have any recommendations for the cost of mental health of mental abuse, because we need to catch up with it sooner. I'm not sure what we can do about that, because even regular mental health, where there's no personal abuse in a family relationship, it's still difficult to get help as far as most people are concerned. And anything in that from what you're speaking now, I'd like to hear in future. I really do appreciate it. Thank you for what you had to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Summers. I mean, listening to you speak, Catherine, I was very struck by you're clearly, you're intelligent, you're articulate, a professional person, and it was only through the kind of happenstance of you going to a counsellor and the counsellor making the suggestion that you go to you get referred to us, that you refer yourself to West Mercy, that happened, that prompted you to do this. And what is frightening is you think, well, how many wouldn't have had that advice? How many that one conversation wouldn't have happened? And very important, the signposting and making that as clear as possible, particularly when we're talking about psychological abuse and emotional abuse. Because I think still in society there's that I think people maybe are not seeing that in the right way. So what would be your reflections on that, and how can we best ensure that that the victim of abuse knows where to go for help and knows that they're entitled to do that, and that they should go and get help and support?
I mean, I'm not sure if this is something which you're able to do, but I've always thought that maybe education in schools is a good place to start, just because, I mean, especially with mental and psychological abuse, it's really difficult to identify. And so just using a really tiny example of this is sort of when it was all starting. I was very close to my sister, and I kind of said to my perpetrator one day, I'm going to go for lunch with my sister. And he went, oh, okay. And I was like, are you okay? You sound sad. And he was like, oh, well, you just always see your sister. And I was like, yeah, we go out quite a lot. And he was just like, well, you never seem to want to spend time with me, and I just wish I was as close to you as she was. And then I felt sorry for him and was like, oh, okay, well, don't worry, we'll do something instead. And before I knew it, I never saw my sister, and I would only see him. And it's sort of that, especially as a younger person, that's really, or even a person who's been in a relationship with them for a long time and it's sort of coming out later, it's really difficult to identify that as abuse, because actually your perpetrator is posing as like someone who's sad and almost someone who's a victim, because they want you to love them, and they kind of think, oh, well, I want you to see me, not them. And you sort of think, oh, I feel like a really bad person because I'm going off and seeing my family, and poor you. And that's what they do. And I think that can be really hard to identify. So I definitely think education in schools at a young age, sort of saying, look, this is acceptable behaviour and this isn't acceptable behaviour, would really, really help people identify it themselves.
Agreed. I think there's both, perpetrator and victim, that understanding needs to be common. So I think it's probably that we don't have clarity around that yet, and there's work to be done, and education in different settings would seem to be a good thing to do. The other thing that you said that I found very alarming was that, and the learning around, so I hope very much that we have got this right now, which is that the lowest point is after you've left the relationship, and the support that you needed there needed to be focused, it needed to be constant, it needed to be rather more than it clearly was, and probably, potentially more family oriented, more trying to look at the support networks and work together with that. So what would be your feelings about how can we improve that offer?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult one, because it's hard. When I rang the Women's Aid helpline, they were the first people I contacted, and I actually rang them 7 times in one night, because I was in such a mess, and they were honestly so helpful. But when you first ring the helpline, you do not tell them your whole story, because at this point it's your first sort of reach out. So you never really get somebody ring the helpline on the first occasion and go, here's a whole history of my life and what's happened. Sometimes you do, but more often than not, they're going to be quite reserved and more of a, is this abuse or is it not? And I kind of want you to tell me whether it is or not. And so it can be a while before, and quite often people will make several calls to the helpline before they even choose to leave that relationship. So for me, the first point I probably disclosed everything was to the police. That was the first point in my stage where I was like, right, I'm going to tell you everything. And I don't know how much information sharing goes, but I think it would have been quite useful if they'd have said, okay, well, do you mind if we give a copy of these notes, not only to Women's Aid as a referral, if they did, but also potentially to your GP and other places which we feel may assist. Because then, perhaps, like, again, it comes into the mental health side of things. The GP can sometimes help with that and get in contact, and having other people then reach out to you outside of them would have been quite useful. It's hard to think of a way to improve it because I know resources are so tight, and I think that's half of the issue, really. But I think that was the point for me where I'd made, like, basically the fullest disclosure, and from that it would have been nice to say, okay, would you mind if we let the GP know about this, and perhaps they can give you a follow-up call to see how you're doing in a week, and would we mind if we gave her information to DV Assist and looked at getting you an injunction or something like that, rather than just get something through the post. I think a bit more sort of contact in that respect would have been better.
Thank you. And last question from me: are you a victim or a survivor?
Survivor. I like it. Sounds better.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions from members of the committee? Councillor Titt.
Thank you, Chair. First, a bit of an observation, which will eventually lead to a question, I promise. Although that question, I think, is probably more usefully aimed to Sue Coleman, if that's all right. She looks as though she's still there. Is that all right? Yes. Obviously, both as ward councillor and as a trustee of the Kindle Centre, I have a degree of experience, shall we say, of the work of the Women's Aid and the work that the Kindle is doing with some of the residents. And recently we had a showcase, for want of a better word, I suppose, of the Building Better Opportunities programme that the Kindle runs, and a number of the women are involved in that scheme. And 2 of them spoke to the meeting, and I was struck by an adjective that they used that has absolutely stuck with me since that meeting, and is very much reflected in what you've had to say this afternoon, Kath. And they said, when we came to Hereford, we were utterly broken. broken, and that word has really, really stuck with me, and I think I shall always remember it. And that every element of their life was broken. This kind of now leads on to the question, which, as I say, I think is probably more usefully geared to Sue. Those two women, and indeed another family that I've been involved in, are all families that have come to Hereford. And I think we all understand the need often for victims, survivors, to leave the area. And it's great that Hereford sort of gets 2 ticks in Sue's book in terms of accommodation. And certainly those women and families that I've dealt with personally have hugely thanked and benefited from the provision that we're able to provide here. I just wondered, Sue, if we are better than other authorities, which I kind of take as your reading of this, does it become problematic? I mean, it may be, Kath, that you've got some experience, but as I say, I'm not sure who I'm aiming the question at. Does it become problematic when we have women or families that we need to move out to other areas where presumably the accommodation provision isn't quite as good?
I'll say that if I may. No, it doesn't. I mean, I would say that our accommodation is probably the best I've ever come across, but we do have obviously we've got 2 refuges and satellite accommodation in Worcestershire, which means that if there are women in Herefordshire that need to move quickly, then overnight we can move them into Worcestershire as long as we've got space, which we usually have. And there's a sister organisation in Shropshire that's got a refuge that is really well appointed. And we're part of the national network of women's aid organisations, which means that where someone needs to leave the area, we're able to plug into that network and find somewhere else for women to go that's safe in any other part of the country. And we have the resources to be able to pay for their transport so that they can get there safely. So there is the potential for, I mean, that's one of the positive things of being part of that federation is that we get the opportunity to work collectively, because quite often it is only safe for those that are fleeing from domestic abuse for them to actually leave the area rather than stay in the area. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think it does. I think it reassures us that that moving women or families out of the area isn't a major barrier to their safety.
It's not difficult. I think I'd like to take the opportunity to pick up on a couple of the points that have been made in discussion. First of all, around emotional abuse and the importance of emotional abuse, and that very much came from Catherine's story. And one of the shortcomings, I would say, of the Domestic Abuse Act is the significant focus on safe accommodation, as long as you've got enough refuge spaces, you've pretty well got everything covered. But in fact, as Catherine's story illustrates, there are a lot of people that are dealing with the immediacy of domestic abuse who would not necessarily want to go to a refuge, or don't necessarily need to go to a refuge, but they do need a lot of support in the community. And really, really significantly, and you'll know this from the work that the Kindle Centre do, for example, there's a great deal of work to be done to support those who've been living with domestic abuse, sometimes for years, in recovering from the impact of that abuse on their self-confidence, their self-esteem, and quite often their mental and emotional well-being. And that kind of work takes time, and that doesn't need a refuge, it doesn't need a building, but it does need skilled and supportive individuals that can work with people in the community. And that's something that there is insufficient emphasis on in the Domestic Abuse Act. And we're hoping that Herefordshire, along with other local authorities, will recognise that having that support within the community is almost as important as having that safe accommodation. Safe accommodation is fundamentally important for those who really need to flee. And again, a point that Catherine made about vulnerability, that the statistics have got worse over the years that I've been in the business. There are now 2 women a week killed by a partner or a former partner in this country. And there's a big body of evidence to show that the most dangerous time for any woman in an abusive relationship, which is physical, is where she's about to leave or has just left. It's where that partner feels that they're losing control. That's when women are really, really hurt. And that's why we need refuges, and we need refuges to be able to take people at a moment's notice and make sure that they're absolutely safe. So in terms of that sense of when you really, really need that intervention, you need that intervention at that point, literally sometimes to save lives. The other point that I'd want to pick up on is the discussion around how we do something in terms of prevention, because I first started working in this business in 1982, which was a bloody long time ago. And although the services have got better, the statistics have not. And we desperately need to find some way of doing something about preventing domestic abuse and not just responding to it. And the comments about doing work in schools and doing work with young people are absolutely understandable. What I would say is that we already do some of that work, and we work alongside West Mercia Rape and Sexual Abuse Support Centre to collaborate and do work in schools to encourage young people to think about respect in relationships, consent in relationships, what a healthy relationship looks like and how they can aspire to that. And I'm really sorry to report that we are seeing increasingly some of the most misogynistic and antagonistic attitudes towards young women and women in general when talking to boys in schools than we have ever seen. So not just is there a lot more work to be done anyway, there is in particular a lot of work to be done to address some of the attitudes of young people currently towards relationships, because they are far from healthy. And sadly, I would say, and we could debate all sorts of reasons why this should be the case, but sadly, a heck of a lot worse than they used to be when I was working with schools. There is a big challenge ahead when we look at some of the attitudes of young people towards what a healthy relationship looks like.
That absolutely begs the question, which is, I don't expect a full evidence answer, but in your experience, what do you think is the reason for a rise in misogyny?
I think there's a backlash. I think there's a not just amongst young people, but in general, I think there's a backlash towards what's perceived as being, certainly from a feminist perspective, women really trying to make sure that violence against women and girls remains very high on the agenda as something that at last needs to be addressed. I think that on a practical level, I think that the availability of online content that shows women as victims and shows women as being abused. I mean, online pornography, for example, for young people is incredibly unhealthy and incredibly unhelpful. And the opportunities that social media platforms give for young people to engage in distant abuse, if you like, in remote abuse it's much easier to be abusive towards someone if they happen to be on the other side of town and you're doing it on your phone. And I think that young people's experience of that kind of abuse is certainly from our work with young people. We do a lot of work with young people in another borough. And that escalated enormously during lockdown. A lot of young people took the opportunities of lockdown to become particularly abusive online, which is incredibly sad, but that technology makes that possible. And unfortunately, when you've got technology that makes it possible to engage with people in that way safely in the comfort of your own bedroom and without any serious consideration of the consequences, and you also have a rise in the availability of toxic images and toxic messages about women, about young women, about sex, about relationships, then it's a bit of a dangerous cocktail, really. And I think that's very, very evident for a lot of young people in our schools at the moment. And I'm not entirely sure that schools themselves on their own have got the capacity or the equipment in the round sense of the term with which to be able to combat that.
Thank you. That's really, I could listen to this all day to talk to you about this. It's such an interesting subject. Councillor Summers, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Many video games are extremely sexist, I notice, like cartoons. It's very cartoonist, I know, but it's also extremely sexist. So that's possibly something to do with the young. It doesn't help the young people very much, especially the young women. I know there's a number of red flags that usually come up with abuse, whether it's children's abuse, adult abuse, or elderly adult abuse, and that's something that we're can't forget here is the elderly abuse by their families. But a lot of it's about not listening, and that's a concern for me. New mothers quite often go through a lot of physical and mental abuse because they spend more time with their children, and the father gets upset, etc., etc. Now we do have access to that through some of our NHS stuff, perinatal, etc., etc. And I think we should be following up on. I'm not sure. I shouldn't say we should. Perhaps we are, but if we're not, we really need to be. We have a whole set up there, and I still think that there is a lot of abuse starts with mothers and pregnant women, etc. The question I have is, how can we? What is in place to catch abuse early? I'm thinking of new mothers here. I think that's one of the keys that we can go to the schools, but the schools are pretty selective. They're hard to get in. Although with the funding coming in from central government, it might become a little easier. But what would you suggest? What is in place to catch abuse early?
As far as young mums are concerned, as far as young adults are concerned, Catherine talked about a presence in hospitals, and that is relatively new. Unfortunately, it's been very difficult during the pandemic, but we do work very closely with local hospitals and Hereford Hospital in particular. And we've been targeting particular departments in hospitals, and antenatal has certainly been one of them, where we're trying to, I've got colleagues that will go into hospital to sit and talk with someone at very short notice if it's identified within an antenatal appointment that person could do with talking to a domestic abuse specialist, or certainly we can talk to them over the phone, or we can make arrangements to meet with them at a later date. We recognise the data is very clear that women in pregnancy are particularly vulnerable to domestic abuse, and I think you articulated the kind of jealousy and concerns that can give rise to that kind of abuse. One of the very, very few positives out of the COVID pandemic has been that hospitals have started to have been asking partners not to go to antenatal appointments. And what that means is that nurses and midwives have the opportunity to talk to a pregnant woman without their partner being there. That's a really good opportunity to ask about whether or not they've got any particular concerns in their relationship. And if they start to disclose those concerns and it sounds like abuse, there's an opportunity there to talk to them about what services are available and actually put them in touch with those services. That's always been very difficult because partners usually rock up to those appointments, but that hasn't been happening. and that's still not happening. And we're certainly being proactive at trying to make sure that we're working as closely as possible with antenatal departments so that we can take advantage of that and make sure that that information is there so that people know that they can contact us. But I would also say that that some of the primary care community are particularly good at identifying where there are concerns about young mums. So school nurses, for example, we work very, very closely with school nurses. A lot of them have done training with us. A lot of them work with us as ambassadors, and they've got a very, very keen eye for where mums with young children might be struggling because they're in an abusive relationship. And that knowledge that they have is something that they share with primary schools in particular, so that people can start to make sure that that information is available and that support can start early.
Can I jump on what Sue said? Because I was actually pregnant during the COVID pandemic. So I have got experience of this. I'm married to a lovely husband now who's not abusive in any way, but at pretty much every appointment and almost all of my appointments, I was asked about my relationship and whether things were okay quite openly. And I do think perhaps because he wasn't able to attend, they felt they could ask me that. And in the very initial appointment, they do go through, is there any history of abuse, not with necessarily your current partner, but with any ex-people in the area, just so that they're aware that, potentially, even though you might not be pregnant with the perpetrator's baby, you could be at risk still in your pregnancy from an ex-partner. And I do feel that the provisions there were really, really good. And there were always signs in the hospital with West Mercia Women's Aid Contact, Women's Aid Helpline. And I was at I remember that being at one appointment and there was a phone number for Polish domestic abuse. And again, we've got quite a high Polish community here. So there were constantly things demonstrated. So I think that's an area which we're really, really good at the moment.
My last question is actually for Paul. We have a pretty good perinatal department up in Belmont. It's been very hard to get information from them, as Councillor Crockett will agree with me on. I'd like to know from Paul is how much do you talk to them? Does anybody from the council talk to them? And what are we hearing? Now they have a number of psychiatrists or a number of psychological helpers up there. We should be taking advantage of them. I'm not sure if we are. I know I've asked them to come to the Herefordshire Worcester Mental Health Group a couple of times now, and we've had very little success. Well, we've had no success in getting them there. I think it's something we really need to step down heavily on, and that's my opinion anyway, because it's been going on now for over a year. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Bob.
I want to respond, Chair.
Yeah,
absolutely. Thanks, Councillor. In response to that specific question, but also reflecting some of the feedback we've had from the survivor, which is incredibly welcome. Thank you for taking the time out to do that today. And from West Mercia Women's Aid themselves. I think a theme that's been coming through for me is one of the, and this is mandated within the new Act, is around the partnership board, because I think that what we've been discussing is, and there was an acknowledgement from the survivor, that sometimes the partners aren't as joined up and there's not as much communication between the different parts of the process. And that's clearly potentially going to lead to extended periods of domestic abuse, which could have been avoided. I think that's been acknowledged. So, of course, partnership boards aren't the answer to everything, and in some ways is an easy response. But I do think that the Act includes some very helpful direction and guidance to say you do need as a system to talk to each other more than you are at the moment, and you do need to start maximising the use of the assets and resources that are available to us as a partnership, and to ensure that when victims do come forward, and hopefully way before the point where someone needs to move out of the county, which of course is an extreme example, hopefully, that as partners we do try and get in early, we do some prevention, we do education at an early stage, and of course as the council moves much more towards an all-age approach to services, support, talk community, etc. I do believe that we're into a new phase now, where we start to work on prevention a lot more than we ever have done before. Resources are available that perhaps weren't there before, And I think there's an absolute aspiration and desire from the council and from partners. It's really encouraging to hear the views from WVT and also obviously from other partners that perhaps have contributed to the strategy, draft strategy in front of us. That there is a desire to be early and to be more preventative and to communicate better and to understand that the more we can do as a partnership, the better we will provide in these areas. I mean, I'm really encouraged by the positivity that comes from the provider today, but I always want to strive for us to do more. And resources are becoming more available from government. I mean, the money that comes with this strategy is welcome, but it's still, we still want more. I don't think refuge is the answer to everything, but of course we're blessed with really good refuge provision. But I'd like us to have the other facilities as well, and working with WVT is really encouraging, and working with the GPs and those sort of areas. I mean, an incredibly selfish example, but my wife had a baby 2.5 years ago, and I know that the health visitor asked that question in my presence. And to be frank, my wife's not going to answer that question honestly if the perpetrator of the abuse is sitting there. I'm not the perpetrator of abuse, obviously, but it seemed a really strange experience to me. They would ask a question about domestic abuse in the presence of the partner, because it seemed almost a pointless question. And I do believe that we've taken advantage of the fact that partners haven't attended, and I suspect we've uncovered more abuse than perhaps we knew about earlier. But I'll really encourage us to engage with partners, and I hope that provides you with a comprehensive answer.
Councillor Marsh. Okay, Councillor Price.
Hello. I'm not sure what the answer to is. So how are we doing in Hereford for accommodation for this situation? We have plenty, or need some people, or are they being sent elsewhere? That's my question today.
I can answer on behalf of, but perhaps we hear from West Mercia. I think they did confirm that we are in a good position, but and then perhaps I'll add to that answer. That's okay, Councillor.
I didn't quite catch all of that, but I think you asked about move-on accommodation.
No, accommodation in general.
So it's about accommodation in general, refuge accommodation. Is it adequate?
Yes.
Adequate. Yes, we believe that we probably have now got enough bed spaces. We do monitor. We obviously we need to keep as full as we can, because we can't avoid to support void bed spaces, but we always keep emergency rooms for people that need them overnight, and we'll always find somewhere else for someone if we are full after that point. We think we've got enough. Certainly the last discussions that we had with the commissioners when we've looked at our data is that we've probably got enough bed spaces. That's the refuge, and it's the I think it's now 9 satellite flats across the county. I think we've probably got enough now.
So I hope that answers the point, Councillor. We seem to be in a very strong position. We've recently, as part of this new strategy, commissioned some additional accommodation because the funding was available, and long may that continue, because we do keep the refuge, unfortunately, very busy, but Sue and the team manage that provision very well. We always have emergency accommodation available where required. And of course, the point that Sue made, which was very, very important, because West Mercia Women's Aid are part of a very large network of Women's Aid, and we have partners with Shropshire and Worcester, etc., there is always another alternative should we require that, and it does help with that networking, absolutely.
Thank you. Councillor Marsh.
A strong response from me to the strategy was just the kind of fury that the assumption seemed to be that it was the women who needed to move. I quite understand from Catherine's point of view, right in the middle of her perpetrator's family, that wouldn't have been an option. But do you feel that the supports in place now, which are quite complicated and I don't fully understand, make it easier for people to stay at home? And also, if people do flee but then can come back, is there an option to come back? Are they still on the tenancy, or in a sense by fleeing, do you just, is that it as far as your chances of remaining? To be truthful, in the place it seems to me that you are perfectly entitled to be, rather than the person who has caused the problem.
We absolutely share your indignation at that. And I'm pleased to say that Catherine is in a new post that we've got within the organisation where she works. I'll let her talk about what she does, but she works specifically with individual women to help them to get the kind of orders that they need to protect them and make it more likely that they'll be able to stay in their own homes. But that has always been one of the greatest injustices about domestic abuse is that those people that have been abused have then had to give up their homes and go and live somewhere else and start again somewhere completely different and outside of the support networks that they would have preferred to have stayed within. The more that can be done to make it possible for women to stay in their own homes, the better. There are other places in this country where they've experimented with identifying short-term accommodation to move perpetrators into, so that people can stay in their own homes. And it's going to be interesting to see how that works. I'm not 100% convinced that it's actually going to solve the problem, but we do need to be a bit more creative in trying to avoid the circumstances where someone who's lived with years of abuse then actually has to give up their home and everything in it. Catherine, if you want to talk a bit about your job, then now's the point to do it.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So I think there's a big difference between owned homes and rented homes, first of all. So obviously, if you own a home joint on a mortgage, that makes things slightly more difficult because if you own the home as a victim in your sole name, then you own the house, and if you're not married, it makes things easier. If he owns property and you're not married, you're not in a very good position because he owns home and you don't have the matrimonial rights which you would have if you were married. But quite a lot of the time, you get sort of a jointly owned home with a dual income as well. As soon as that person's on that property, they've got a right to return to it no matter what. So if you stay there, you're potentially putting yourself in an unsafe position. We tend to find and it's the same with the tenancy. So if you have a joint tenancy, again, they have a right to come back. And we're finding a lot with landlords that they are refusing to take off a perpetrator from the tenancy, even when they've been removed by the police. So say the police have removed them, they've put them on police bail not to go back to that property. Landlords are saying, well, actually, no, we've got to keep them on there, I'm afraid, because they're a listed tenant, and unless they give us notice they want to be removed, we're not going to remove them. So as soon as that police bail is up, they can come straight back to the property. And again, you're in that position where you're unsafe. So I think at the moment, the reason women are fleeing is because it's kind of the safest option for them, but it's not right that they have to do that and uproot everything. My role is non-molestation orders work to a degree, so they will prevent somebody from contacting in a way which is harassing, pestering them, intimidating them. And that you can also include provisions that they're not allowed near the home. So quite often the judge will include a provision that they're not allowed within 100 metres of where you're living or any other property they believe that you are living, if it's private accommodation that they don't know about. And obviously that can include a shared accommodation you've had together. And with that, you can also apply to the court for a transfer of tenancy, where you can say, right, I'm going to get the court to force the transfer of this tenancy from joint names into a sole name of somebody. But a lot of landlords are saying, well, we're not going to take them off until we've got that order from the court. And so it's sort of an extra stepping stone. And it's quite often my role, because legal aid is so severely cut at the moment. Our role is sort of for the people who aren't always eligible for legal aid but can't afford a solicitor. So they're in this weird middle section, which is actually probably the majority of working people, where they're sort of saying, well, we don't want them to come back, and we're now in a rush to get this order in place before the bail ends. Otherwise, they're going to come straight back to the property, and I'm at risk. Occupation orders is an order which you can get to remove, that specifically removes somebody from the property. And that's a slightly different one. They are incredibly difficult to get on an emergency basis, simply because you're asking the judge to make sure somebody gives up their home rights. So a non-molestation order will sort of prevent them from coming to the property, but doesn't remove their home rights. So they work slightly differently. So we tend to, if we can, go down the non-molestation route because it will do the same thing. And an occupation order can be really difficult to get. The problem we've got with people fleeing and wanting to return is the moment they leave, the judge will quite usually will say, well, you've got somewhere to go. He hasn't. Therefore, we're not going to grant any order which removes him from the property because clearly you've got somewhere to go and he hasn't. And that is a problem. Whereas if they are removed by the police and therefore put on police bail, they have been removed and have basically been forced to stay somewhere else. So that's the best position. But that involves the victim having to get the police involved, and they're not always ready to do that. That's quite a big step for a victim to take, to notify the police and to get that police involvement, especially where you're worried that other agencies might sort of get involved with, social services with children. And that can sometimes be the best thing. But in that moment, in that time, you don't always think about it like that. You just think about getting out. We're doing something at the moment where we're sort of looking at potentially why people don't report things to the police, and that is a massive reason. A lot of people just don't think about doing that. They just want to get them and their kids out safely, and that's all they're thinking about. And it's only when they're out and you're sort of saying, well, actually, you might not be able to go back now, that they're thinking, oh, okay, I just wanted to be safe and I wanted to go back because, our school's here, our life's here, my network's here. And so that is a problem. And there's not really, I think that is a problem that does need to be looked at and addressed, because if there is a way of keeping victims in their houses more safely, then that would be better, because judges will say, well, you've got somewhere to go and he hasn't, therefore, we're not going to remove him from the house.
Thank you very much. That was a great question, a very interesting answer. Thank you. Do any other members, Councillor Summers?
Yeah, I just want to throw, it's not personal, it happened to someone that actually across the street from me. She was beaten up at least 3 or 4 times. He was arrested a couple of times and she kept going back. And finally she left. But it seemed there was very little that anyone could do. They would take him, they would arrest him, and that would be the end of it. And the next day he'd be back in his home again. Do you find this is quite normal? I know it's a hard question to answer. There's a lot of people out there, but this just seemed unique. I even had our talk community involved in it, and it was difficult to do anything. So she finally did stay away, but it took a long time to convince her also, because she figured she loved it, she wanted to keep going back. But isn't there more the police can do? Anyway, that's just my question, because it did happen for real.
I'll give a fairly general answer, really. I mean, and in every circumstance, there are all sorts of different factors at play. I mean, one is the experience and the confidence of the police that attend. Another is the extent to which the police feel that they've got enough evidence to actually charge anyone or to release them on any kind of conditional bail. Then there's the extent to which they consider, if they have got enough evidence, whether the Crown Prosecution Service will consider that enough evidence to then make a prosecution. So there's all sorts of different factors. Quite often the police will remove someone in the hope and then make the person in the home safe for that evening, but whether or not they then feel that they've got enough to be able to do anything further with that individual to stop that individual from going back there is it's quite often a bit of a lottery, I would say.
Yeah, is it possible, now he was disabled either mentally and semi-physically, is it possible to put it bluntly, we're feeling sorry for him? I know I protected her one night, found her in the bus stop, and another time he actually bit her. That was the kind of relationship it was. But he was himself.
Councillor Summers, this is.
No, I just want to ask him the question.
It's too detailed, I think, for any response to be able to answer the specifics of the case that you're referring to, I'm afraid. So thank you. Do we have any other questions from members of the committee for West Mercia Women's Aid? So on behalf of the committee, thank you again for joining us this afternoon. You're welcome to stay in here the rest of the debate if you want to. You're busy people, we know, so please feel free to leave. Thank you very much for your time. It's been very much appreciated. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
You're more than welcome. Thank you. So I'm now going to invite Paul back to introduce the report and lead into the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. As indicated previously, I will provide a summary of all the changes from the previous strategy document. The strategy that you before you today is currently in draft and will be subject to extensive consultation from November onwards. The Domestic Abuse Act 21 does mandate us to have a number of various enhancements to our current strategy. And I'll give you a quick list of those, although in terms of the report, section 4, section 3 of the report of the strategy, so the strategy documents itself, gives you an update of where we are against the existing strategy. The existing strategy is between 2019 and 21, and section 3 of the strategy document does give you an update as to where we are with that strategy. And then in terms of section 4 of the strategy document, items 1 to 5 in section 4 do lead you to the areas that are within the new strategy and part of the Act. And as we've alluded to previously, we must appoint a multi-agency domestic abuse local partnership board. And as I said, that's not a solution in itself, but I think it will help with the communication that's been discussed today. And we will certainly be attempting to recruit as many partners that are key stakeholders in this as we possibly can. We have a needs assessment that is with you as an appendix today, and that will form the basis of the consultation going forward. So appendix is with you today in terms of the needs assessment. It requires us to develop and publish a strategy for the provision of such support, and of course that links into the needs assessment, and of course the draft strategy is with councillors and scrutiny today for discussion. It mandates us to increase the provision of safe accommodation and to commission, and of course we've already taken that measure, and that's been discussed today, resulting in the view of the provider that Herefordshire is well provisioned in terms of secure accommodation, both on a very traditional refuge basis, but also on dispersed accommodation, which is often very successful for particularly families and abuse victims with small children, etc. And then also to mandate to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of the strategy. So a strategy in itself, of course, again, like a partnership board, is not a solution, but having a documented strategy that we can measure our success against is helpful. And of course, one of the primary deliverables of the new partnership board will be to manage and to monitor the performance against the new strategy document once the consultation has been concluded and we have a strategy document which all stakeholders have had the opportunity to contribute to, and that has been widely consulted on, so that it does hopefully meet the needs of Herefordshire, and of course supports the victims and survivors of domestic abuse within the county. There are a number of statistics that are produced by West Mercia Women's Aid as part of our contractual arrangements, and we will make those available to consultees so they can see the current statistics that are available for you to make decisions and for you to ask questions and observations about. And one of the gaps identified in the new legislation is around individuals with protected characteristics. So, of course, we predominantly think of domestic abuse as male and female, but of course it does exist in all the communities that we live within Herefordshire and beyond. And so there is an amount of funding that allows us to extend our reach into areas of protected characteristics, and to understand that things such as LGBTQ, there is a number of abuse opportunities and occurrences in that community, and there are a number of more diverse communities within Herefordshire. And it was encouraging to hear that we have a specific concentration around Eastern European migrants within Herefordshire in the hospital, because of course we have a growing and welcome population in that area within Herefordshire. So the paper is before you. We are obviously seeking your support around the strategy document and the paper itself, but I'm very happy to open the floor to a number of questions and observations. hopefully we should be able to respond today. Of course, if we can't provide a comprehensive response to your questions today, we will have come forward with a written answer to any question that we can't address. And I do offer my thanks to the officers that have put this report together. Unfortunately, none of which are with us today because through a combination of leave and actually one of the officers has now left the appointment of the authority, we do have a slight deficit in the officer representation that we would normally expect, but I believe that between myself and Mrs. Appleby, who is present, that we can answer the questions that the committee puts before us today.
Thank you, Mr. I'm going to start by making a comment. I wouldn't want to know any do, but somebody needs to read this strategy through from start to finish, because it has way too many literals, typos, and cut and paste that doesn't make any sense anymore. You know, one or two does happen, but there's a raft. Some of them are quite entertaining, gotta say. There's royal assent, as in Her Majesty in a hot air balloon, versus royal assent. And there is some areas that need substantial redrafting because they just don't make any sense anymore.
Comments were also echoed at a previous committee, I have to say, Councillor.
Okay, so definitely before this gets in front of the public, somebody needs to go through it thoroughly. Okay. It occurred to me, and actually it was something that Catherine picked up on, that given the specifics of Herefordshire, I think some more emphasis, or maybe just drawing out the emphasis on rurality and the challenges of that would sit well, because I didn't feel that the plan didn't seem to me to be particularly woven into the talk community work. That there were kind of mentions of it, but it didn't feel central to me. And these are, you know, there are specific problems. I think Catherine, she actually articulated it brilliantly well. That's the reality of closed rural communities. That if you are in a situation of physical, emotional, psychological abuse in such a community, it can be very challenging. And I think we need to have some specific work around that. And perhaps looking into the future to take account of the phenomenon of social media and remote abuse within the definitions and what the strategy is going to do with that.
Hi, just one comment, stroke, maybe it's a question.
Sorry, who have we got talking? Is it, sorry,
Sorry, I'm Christine Price from Healthwatch.
oh, thank you so much, Christine.
Okay.
Yes, I just, my laser eyes are not big enough.
I was just wondering about how this works with children's services and the various other committees, safeguarding, children's improvement, and actually you touched upon prevention from an all-age perspective, and introducing another partnership board. Whilst it would help this agenda, we need to be careful with the ranges of committees that we've got going on, and also recognising that abuse is often a family issue that affects children and in the family as well. And I just wondered perhaps if the strategy could reflect that a little bit more.
Thank you, Christine. Good observation. And of course, we this has been ongoing for some time, perhaps, and as a council, we've begun to progress quite rapidly to an all-age approach over the last 6 months. So there's perhaps some catching up to do in terms of our strategy direction. The formation of the partnership board is mandated, but of course it can take many forms, and we do have lots of partnership boards that already exist. So forming the partnership board perhaps could be a sub-partnership board of an existing one to make sure that it retains the profile. But of course, one of the difficulties of the numbers of partnership boards we have as a system is that it tends to be the same people around the table. And that often begins to be incredibly resource hungry? And do you get the richness of conversation when the same set of people are around the table with a different agenda on the particular day? So we'll take that into consideration, and with your permission, I'd like to discuss that specific point with Healthwatch and part of the community partnership. As part of the integrated care system, we are developing a community partnership. And I believe that some of the partnership boards that are under development, that do exist, and that perhaps are due a refresh in terms of reference, could be influenced by that community partnership, because the community partnership will effectively be all-encompassing as part of the integrated care system. So perhaps we could take that question off, if that's okay, Chair. We'll come back with a response specific to that point.
Okay. Thank you. And just for clarification for anyone watching, that the scrutiny committee will do the question first. I will then refer to Healthwatch for comment. So, because otherwise it gets confused, people don't know whether you're answering a question or part of the committee or I'm sorry about that. Okay. Where have we got to? So yeah, so talking about the integration with talk community, and particularly the challenges around rurality, that we probably need to consider other existing networks like the diocesan network, indeed parish councils, you know, that peripheral nervous system of the county and the way in which information might flow to and from those areas as part of the strategy was my thought about that, and specifics around rurality. And that would also sort of pick up a bit on the point. I mean, really heartening, actually, the comments from West Mercia Women's Aid about the provision of refuge. That's encouraging. I think probably, you know, we're unlikely ever to say, yes, we have enough. But it's very good to know that we're so well placed. That was encouraging. Having said that, I do feel that there's probably more conversation around holistic approaching and also to equalise a little bit around physical abuse, emotional, psychological, coercion, remote, you know, and in a sense we need to establish a greater degree of parity in the minds of the public, certainly, and probably for us as well, and make sure that we have a provision that is appropriate to the nature of the abuse and to service the needs of the person being abused. So I think there was that kind of holistic, a rounded approach, which would again seem to me to suggest that talk community, that wraparound offer would be worthwhile in this instance as well.
Thank you for those comments, Chair, and I wholeheartedly support and agree that. In that, I think traditionally we've got excellent provision, but of course, we would always want to support us to the level that is required. But I think as an organisation, in terms of the council and also the system, we do need to begin to exploit those opportunities that talk community particularly presents to us, and also the integrated care system. And one of the advantages of the pandemic has been that our partnership working with partners is much closer than it ever was before, and that holistic opportunity, where it was seen as perhaps that it was a singular organisational response, we're moving on from that, and I absolutely agree with you. We can begin to use the community and the resilience and the assets available, and also partners' opportunity to contribute to this agenda is growing, and at the moment the strategy perhaps initially was still seen as a council initiative, and now needs to become much more of a system-wide initiative and a community initiative. And I think that is reflected in the strategy document, but perhaps not to the level that we would want it to be.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it is in there, but I just didn't feel that it had a place that was saying this is our county, these are the challenges of the specifics, and how how we would approach them. But it just seems to be worthy of a particular line. I was also going to pick up on something that Catherine was talking. We were talking about education, about prevention education. But schools, very difficult environment, I think, and difficult to gauge when it's the right age group and how to do this. But definitely, I think we could be having conversations. Our partners could be having conversations in colleges, particularly the agricultural colleges. That's a very good age group to start to form relationships, and probably this information would be appropriate at that age. I think we could be confident of that. I'm going to also pick up again, the plan is referring to the strengths-based approach, but the sentence is a strengths-based approach with victims, and it just struck me as a peculiar combination linguistically, and that perhaps survivors might be the appropriate word in that sentence. I'm not entirely clear about how the domestic abuse strategy delivery group is going to relate to the partnership board when it's amended to provide, quote, a higher level of executive group. And it just started to form in my mind as being slightly top heavy and frontline delivery light, were the channels of communication going to be good and strong all the way through the structure?
I think that's the plan, if I'm being honest, Chair. And of course, the delivery group should be the doer, should be the nuts and bolts of actually making sure we deliver the strategy, and we ensure that the services on the ground are effective and appropriate, and bring in all the assets that partners can bring to the table. And I think that the partnership board will hold the delivery group to account to some extent, and perhaps the partnership board will be at a more senior level within organisations and will be more strategic in its focus, and the delivery group will effectively be the business as usual day-to-day delivery of the service and day-to-day management of West Mercia and Women's Aid, so in partnership with the provider.
Well, that's what I would hope. But the plan actually says that the delivery group is being amended to provide, quote, a higher level of executive group, which sort of sounds somewhat different to the practical operational role that you describe.
I think that's more of a leadership issue. Perhaps the way it's written, perhaps is slightly
maybe
unhelpful.
Check that and sort of see if it's clear, because it wasn't entirely clear to me how they're going to relate to each other, and whether clearly terribly important that lines of communication both between partners and from the strategic to the operational are strong here. So probably just sense check that all.
Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Summers.
Thank you, Chair. There seems to be a considerable help for domestic abuse, and it's been well covered, although there is a huge crossover which we need to be looking at. For example, same-sex marriage, a lot of abuse there, LGBTQ, young people. I know this is where the crossover gets even stronger, is young people that are involved in that relationship and family, and of course county lines, and Cuckling, which all comes into the abuse situation, usually stemming from a parental abuse. So is there enough experience in those departments? Do we have enough experience in those areas? We have the experience, I understand, in typical family abuse, domestic abuse, but there are those crossovers which are more and more. There are more and more as time goes on, because people are changing their way of living, changing their relationships. So we need to be looking at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I mean, the new strategy and the requirements of the Act do absolutely mandate us to expand our breadth and our ability to look at other areas outside of the traditional domestic abuse relationship. So that is absolutely part of the intention of the strategy. But I think that it has to be recognised that Herefordshire will need to learn in that area. I don't think we're as advanced in that area as perhaps other parts of the UK, simply because We are a more rural county, we're not as diverse as some parts of the country. Of course, becoming more diverse and welcome of that. So I do think we have learning in those areas. And of course, working with West Mercia and Women's Aid, who are part of a wider network, will absolutely assist with that. Because we don't have the expertise that perhaps they would have in more urban areas.
Thank you.
I think Mrs. Appleby wants to answer that.
I was going to add around the other partnership groups, the crime safety partnership group, the safeguarding board, both have multidisciplinary input, and we cover some of those subjects within that, just as we would adult abuse. We cover many of the cross-cutting issues that you've mentioned there. So I believe that absolutely, as Paul says, there's more to be learned from looking externally. We have got information coming into those boards at this moment, and I can see that there'd be some work around partnership boards and how we ensure that that issues such as this aren't diluted across, but that we've got the right people in the right boards having the right discussions. I think there is work to be done around that.
That's good too, because my big concern, of course, is same-sex marriages. Well, men marrying men, women marrying women, and the abuse could be typically more than in traditional relationships. I'm not saying it is, but it could be because of the situation they're in, mentally wise, etc. So yeah, we need to make sure that we are experiencing that in those areas, and because it's no longer traditional, I'm afraid. So we need to make sure we have everything going. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sellers. Councillor Tillett.
Thank you, Chair. Right at the start of this, the Chair urged a bit of a look through of the whole thing to iron out some of the linguistic discrepancies and typos and so on. And I'm glad you've taken that on board, because it was also a concern of mine. But in a way, I'd quite like a similar approach to be taken to the whole concept of data and data capture, and because again, it feels a little bit inconsistent. I mean, bear with me, this is slightly perverse, but if I work backwards through the strategy, obviously from page 50 onwards, there is an absolute sea of data, much of it I know provided by external sources, and that is very welcome and very interesting and very useful. But then if we go back a little bit to sort of the early page 30s and so on, when we talk about the priorities, and again, quite clearly, the priorities include to collect and use data effectively, to ensure data is collected and collated, to provide a clear understanding. And obviously, I don't think any of us disagree with that. But then we go back a little bit nearer the front, page 24 refers to enhanced data capture that was possible during the pandemic. Well, if nothing else, I think a bit of explanation there would be helpful. But then, you go to the front of the report, really, and really throughout the first 20, 30 pages, endless references to inconsistency in the data, incompletion of the data, some of the groups that Councillor Summers talked about, the fact that some data is not routinely recorded, and that's not our fault. But why the police can't record whether the perpetrator is a same-sex partner or an opposite-sex partner is a little bit beyond me. And the fact that we've got underrepresentation in the data. So the report starts by flagging up lots of data inconsistencies. And as it goes on, it leans more heavily onto data and suggesting that there's a great deal of data there. So it just feels that we move from one realm to another as we work our way through the strategy. And I just think it would be helpful to reflect what the situation is all the way through, and in particular to tell us what measures there are going to be to combat some of these deficiencies, discrepancies, and gaps in the data. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Of course, the consistency of data is incredibly important, and I know we often return to this subject matter during discussions around reports, and of course that perhaps there's a recognition that our ability to collect and retain and to use data is an area of development for us as a system and as an organisation. I think that that's acknowledged, and we should pursue that with vigour, in my view, because I am incredibly passionate about data being accurate and making evidence-based decisions. I think that's very important. The report's been written over a number of months, and perhaps some of the discovery during the development has led to some contradiction, perhaps, as you've pointed out, that we started off with one view and we've developed and progressed our view as the report. But that should mean that we reflect that from page 1 onwards. We shouldn't, though we build a report up in layers, which is you would expect, we should back check that the layers still reflect our findings. So I think that's a reasonable point to have made. And of course, being quite open, there have also been at least 3 different officers involved in the formation of this report because of people either on leave or people leaving, and that's no excuse whatsoever, which should still be checked. But I believe that inconsistency needs to be corrected, and I welcome that comment and feedback.
Councillor Marsh?
Yes, no, I'm delighted to hear that, because I must say, it was kind of felt a bit like a roller coaster. So by the time this one had gone up, but we thought it was underreported, and that one had gone down, but we thought it was overreported. And quite clearly, Paul, we all would love to have lovely, well-behaved data to make evidence-based decisions on it, but I think we have to be truthful that the data will always be somewhat murky, and that we will just have to cope with that. Just on one particular point, it mentioned somewhere that the police were a sort of exemplar because of their extremely high reporting rates. And I seem to remember from previous discussions in children's that at that time, which was before some of the recent work, the feeling was that the police were wildly over-reporting. So on a factual level, I would quite appreciate knowing whether we now think that the police, that was spot on, or whether it is possible that they were being remarkably thorough in their reporting. So I've got a number of questions. Is it better to tell you all of them and then go through them again, or go through them one at a time? I don't know. Yes, I hoped it was going to be straightforward, but it is both distressing and much more prevalent than we'd like. And I read a very recent report about a study of young men who, well, I don't know if it was just young men, but probably who just arrived at university, and it was, a remarkably small number of them had been responsible for a very large number of sexual assaults, and this was at age presumably 19. And so the idea of working with colleges did indeed seem to be an excellent one. Anyway, I really would like it if the strategy could start from the assumption that the person who is the victim should be staying where they are. I quite understand that in many cases that isn't possible, but I think, like we say that pedestrians are most important, frankly, that's not something we always deliver on, but at least we should start by clearly saying that it's our belief that they should be staying and not the other way around. So I was slightly worried that it seemed to have been weakened, because in the previous document, sorry, there were so many different things to read, but at 6.2, it no longer mentions staying in your own home, whereas in the old strategy, it did. So I would very much like that not to be the case, because in the needs strategy, it did say that many victims want to remain in their own home. So perhaps that could be tidied up. I was also sort of had some questions which may not be able to be answered, that we got lots of estimates of victims, but we didn't have any idea of the numbers of perpetrators, and indeed whether, you know, how much someone was leaving one relationship and then doing exactly the same thing again. And I suppose that would be through the, I don't know whether, I'm not really very familiar with the sex offenders register. I have no idea if domestic abuse counts as, maybe that's a practical thing you could just actually tell me.
Councillor, just in response to that, I think Clare's Law would be very helpful in that situation, because of course that legislation came about because of exactly that position where previous an individual had been a perpetrator in a previous relationship, and the ability for a potential new victim to receive disclosure of previous crimes and perpetration is available via Clare's Law. That is partially noted within the strategy document and the documents before us today, but I think that would be the route for that, and an incredibly useful piece of legislation, of course.
And would that work even if it was a verbal caution, as Catherine mentioned, for instance, not so much a heavy intervention, but to be truthful, even plucking up your courage to do enough to get a verbal caution would be
I think I'd have to, being honest, Council, I'd have to refer to my legal colleague because I don't know the detail of Clare's Law, how far that penetrates.
I don't know that necessarily domestic violence would link in with going onto the sex offenders register. Obviously, in relation to Clare's Law, that's fairly recent inclusion which enables, as the director said, which enables individuals to check whether or not somebody has got any previous convictions, which would help them in that situation if they were living with somebody.
Would a caution count as a previous conviction? Probably not.
A caution, I think it does count as a previous conviction, yes, it's certainly taken into account is on record.
Thank you. Well, that's helpful. Thank you. And also, there wasn't very much about the timetable of justice, because I know, you know, the recent femicide case, our Prime Minister was very keen to bang rapists behind bars, but I understand the reality is more that, from my attempts to understand the figures, that the numbers of reports have gone up, but the numbers of charges and summons have gone down. And I entirely understand that's the police rather than a Herefordshire Council thing. But given the immensely long time lags now in which got much worse of the pandemic, I wondered whether, again, in the sense of openness and frankness, that we perhaps should acknowledge that those deterrents were not perhaps as, not, I don't know what happens to people while they're waiting, whether they're still sitting in their homes or.
It's difficult for me to comment on the performance of another public body, but I would suggest that the partnership board approach and the closer working relationship between statutory and partner agencies will assist in that area, because if it becomes apparent as a partnership and as a system that there is an emerging trend around, for want of a better term, performance around bringing cases to fruition or completion of investigations, etc. Of course, we can't hold the statutory body to the police to account, but at least the partnership will make those things visible, perhaps. And then, of course, there is an opportunity for that to become visible publicly, and of course, that may assist with lobbying and leverage, etc. So it's beyond our control, of course, but the more visible the statistics and the data is from all partners, I do believe that begins to build a body of evidence to then sway opinion and to influence direction.
And would the judiciary be on? Because, to be fair to the police, it's not all up to them, is it? There was a lot of discussion from Catherine about the difficulty of the police going, well, yeah, I believe you, love, but that's not enough. So I just wondered if the judiciary were also on.
The honest answer is, councillors, I don't know whether the judiciary will be represented, but we'll take that question away.
And then there was just one question, which at paragraph 29, it said cheerfully that there were no extra resources, but it does seem to me that given the requirement both to provide all this, to provide now the legal requirement to provide accommodation, and the fact that children now explicitly visit victims, it did seem to me that even if in the short term government were providing it, that we should flag up that it's not resource neutral that we are able to do it because we're getting extra support, because say in the future that support wasn't forthcoming, it would become a budget pressure. So it's probably too late to rewrite that bit, but it did seem to me we should be a little bit more frank that the reason there wasn't a resource thing was because at this precise moment we have funding. If you could say how long it's guaranteed for, that would be reassuring, but often that's a short period, isn't it? A central funding guarantee.
I mean, in terms of that point, Councillor, of course, the resources are available for the enhancements as we speak today, and we enjoy the benefits of those enhanced resources for now. But I guess my response is that in all commissioning and operational matters, resources are there for the period in which they are available, and of course government policy may alter fairly rapidly or extend them. So as we stand today, the statement that we have the resources available to implement the mandated elements of the new Act is correct. How far that is a reality is difficult for us to comment on, because of course we're not in control of that matter. But of course, were we to reach a position where resources weren't available for the enhancements that we've commissioned and that we've put in place, of course we would raise that as part of any discussion, and of course we would have to highlight that as a pressure as a local authority should that arise. But we're sort of in that position with most funding streams, that the money is there for as long as the money is there, and when it becomes unavailable we raise a pressure concern, and then we discuss that as a local authority and as a system about how we might address the issues that generates.
Yes, I suppose it just looks so deeply reassuring, doesn't it? You go, oh, not a problem. Yes, it's easy for us all to forget that underneath this sort of happy moment, you know, there may be bear traps. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got a little bit more kind of sort of thoughts about the data, the presentation of data and the issues around that. And one thing that did strike me is particularly with Herefordshire that we've got, you know, a very specific demographic, and therefore data that refers only to a percentage but doesn't contextualise is a bit meaningless. So that we need to make sure that there's context around that, and sometimes then that might raise a question. So looking at black and minority ethnic percentage, it seems to be not in line with the 2011 percentage on the census, but obviously that's not particularly current. So do we have other numbers for that, and how do you contextualise that, and how do we explain it within the document? That's just sort of one example, but it's just sort of trying to give a narrative around the data. Otherwise it just seems to be kind of, you know, numbers, and then we're not really certain how that fits within the whole. So that was one kind of specific around data that was a problem for me. The refuges, just a kind of question around that, the plan does specify about provision for male and those with protected characteristic and complex needs and so on. So do we have specific provision within the refuges for those groups?
In the enhanced provision that has been commissioned as a result of the new Act, we have not within the original refuge, but within the dispersed accommodation, we have the ability to accommodate people with protected characteristics. We don't commission a specific service for each protected characteristic, but we have a recognition that we need to accommodate that need within our provision.
Okay, that's good to know. Maybe we draw that out a bit more on that.
Yes.
But thanks. I kind of, if it's there, I've missed it, so it's, that might be worth drawing out, because that's good to know. Signposting, again, that's kind of quite a simple thing, but it's really, really essential, as we learnt from listening to Catherine, and particularly signposting. Speaking, we're looking at our partner agencies, but there are also national agencies which we could refer out to as well. And I think that would be a useful kind of part of the document to do. I had to wait until I think section 8 before the document was addressing rurality. specifically. And it's acknowledged as an issue in the Rural Crime Network's report, Captive and Control. But the plan was a bit vague about what we're going to do about it. And I think it's that frustration. I think actually we need to put a bit more on the bones there. We just say wider community engagement work, which I'm sure that's the gist of it. But we could put more around that. I think, given the work that we're doing elsewhere, with community brokers, talk community. There's a whole bunch of stuff that is going on, and actually we're just about joining that up, and we could strengthen that element massively, and then looking to see what other partners we might reach out to. Diversity Network, the NFU, the Rural Chaplaincy was another one. I thought that could be a useful partner here.
Councillor Crockett needs to leave, Chair. I do messages on the screen.
Oh, okay. Councillor Crockett, are you having to leave us?
Sorry, Chair, I have to go at 4:30, so
Would you like to make a comment now then?
yeah, thank you. Sorry about that. Well, thanks everybody for this very interesting and lively debate. As we all know, it's a draft strategy at the moment, and we welcome your input. It is a statutory duty, but more importantly, I think we have a moral duty to look at this in depth. And I really welcome all those comments that you've put today, and we will take those on board. And I will look at the recommendations. Oh, well, I'll follow those up perhaps tomorrow. I thank Paul for updating this strategy as much as he could due to the recent legislative changes. It's not very easy to see, say, sorry. I also thank the Women's Refuge for West Mercia Women's Refuge for coming along today and giving their input here. So much positivity from that, which we all welcome, and we, thank goodness, have got a really good relationship with them and working well with them. It's also a very positive point that there's recognition that children are acknowledged and supported in this area of care as well. One of the negatives, I think, that I've touched on really is the disappointing school input. I think we really need to follow that through. There is obviously room to explore for better engagement there with colleges, schools and other youth activity areas. But again, just thank you very much for your input, and I will listen and wait your comments and recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Crockett. Thanks. So just the final one on data, which is confusion over where you've got data that refers to West Mercia. It's not clear whether it's Herefordshire or West Mercia, but it just that will be an easy one to clarify, hopefully. And I was really pleased to see a survivor group being put forward. That's a very good development indeed. Right, do you have any other questions or comments from members of the committee? No, so further comment from Health Watch, Christine?
No further comments.
Thank you. We've heard from Councillor Crockett. Thank you, Councillor Crockett. So we're now going to move on to recommendations. So the committee is asked to determine any recommendations it wishes to make. I'm hopeful that some of our recommendations have been picked up in passing.
Yeah, I think I've picked up a few as we've been going through, Chair. So some of them I've tried to sort of condense together, but so if I put those up as a starter and add to them. Bigger.
if possible. I'd answer my question.
Yeah, fantastic, thank you.
Right. Okay, so so what I've got thus far, that the report be checked for typographical errors, clarity and appropriate use of language.
Can I just jump in there?
Yes, Councillor Summers.
I agree with that, but also I'm not saying anything about Paul and his group. I'd like to see a more concise document. It's not just the clarity and errors, it's just that there's a lot of new stuff and I like it married up with the beginning and the end, so we get more concise information out of there. So I understand, Paul, that you've gone through some transient times in the past few months, and it shows in the document. I just like it blanched out, so from the beginning, when we come to the end, it's all running together. I don't think it does right now. It's just my feeling. Thank you.
Okay, carrying on.
Want any additional wording put to that, or does that cover sufficiently that we improve the clarity?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think that the recommendation covers it sufficiently, and Councillor Summers has clarified what that meant to Mr. Smith, and I think we can take that as being sufficient. Thank you.
So B, that greater emphasis be placed on specific issues relating to rurality.
Yep.
C, that links to talk community be improved within the strategy, examples being drawing on existing networks and the benefits of holistic support packages. That social media and remote abuse be included within the definitions of abuse. The strategy should start with the assumption that the victim of abuse should be able to stay in their own home where this is possible, and that the collection, presentation and contextualisation of data in the report be reviewed and improved.
We have something about work within educational settings, colleges.
Be reviewed and strengthened.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. And can we have a recommendation around consideration of language in terms of victim or survivor when we're using it in conjunction with the phrase strengths-based approach? Specifically.
Can I add that to A, or do you want that as a separate? Would be useful.
Yeah, you could put it in A, that would be fine, yeah.
To my mind, what's always been quite lax is comms. When this is all put to bed and it's running well, if we could come up with a brochure and also do some Saturday tent stuff in centre town to really broadcast this. It's always there, but we really need to be pushing on it now. And as far as the public is concerned, now, I know there's things about pharmacists have a name they can use. There's a lot of stuff there, but there's really not much comms attached to it. I'm just wondering if we can come up with some comms. I don't know what Paul thinks of that.
Councillors, could we add that to recommendation C perhaps, because many of the benefits of talk communities, the penetration within communities, and we can use social media.
There's definitely benefits around that, and just benefits around this definition, because I think there are probably a lot of people for whom it will be somewhat of a surprise to discover that abuse also covers remote abuse, emotional abuse, so on and so forth.
So we could do a good brochure.
So I think there'd be a great deal of merit in trying to
if we have funding anyway.
Yeah.
If we have funding, maybe we can steal some of it.
Absolutely. I mean, the awareness raising of the opportunities to report abuse and to be supported is absolutely critical to the success. Absolutely.
Well, it may. I mean, we know that we have an under-reporting, so that and some of that may sit around the issues around definition. So I think that's good. Thank you, Councillor Something. It's very helpful.
Perhaps could we add to Councillor Summers' idea about being concise about it being a sort of plain English, because as Councillor Wood says, there are many confusions about different sorts of abuse, and it would be nice to have quite a short,
I think actually that would be a sort of separate document.
Okay. That would be another document.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm not saying it would be. No, it's not
That would be the
your.
leaflet, I think.
But we perhaps could aspire to a
Perhaps a companion
clear
leaflet.
English.
That would be the leaflet, I think, Paul.
Yeah, well, I guess councillors, as part of the comms that we talked about, and of course using all the tools that we've got available to us to make sure that we do communicate and promote the availability of the reporting, and very many different ways of reporting, of course, both physical and with to different partners. I think that we should make it as easy as possible for abuse to be reported,
Yeah.
as many media as possible, and with as many partners as possible. So whilst that may not be a recommendation in its own right, I think it needs to be recognised that within particular recommendation C, we should include that as part of the deliverables. And in fact, to ensure that that does happen, as part of the engagement and stakeholder piece that we will undertake to get to the final strategy, because of course this is draft at this point, although quite a mature draft, I think, in many instances. I think that should be one of the parts that the engagement strategy with stakeholders and with victims and survivors. I think we should include that as one of our deliverables to make sure that the ability to report and to seek support and help is as maximum as it can be. I don't know if you've got a view around that, Mandy, because that's definitely something that we include around safeguarding and those sorts of issues.
Absolutely, I really support that. In particular, I mean, we need to look at the stats for safeguarding itself, which have actually declined around domestic abuse over the last few years, when you would actually expect it to increase. So I think particularly, but right across the board, there needs to be emphasis on that.
I think, Paul, that comes back to the talk community. I know my wife gets emails twice a week now, I think, with different things that are going on. And the parish councils are doing a lot of work, and they've been given money. So for that, they should be posting this stuff on their bulletin boards, et cetera, or even having in-house stuff to push it along. Anyway, that's enough from me.
I think definitely we need to put creative thinking into how to get the definitions out there and the signposting, because that's the key information, isn't it? So is this what you think it is, and where do you go for help, nationally, locally, community?
Yeah, I recently filled up with petrol, and there was something on the petrol pump about women's aid in part of the UK where I live, and it was quite interesting that that's a real direct piece of marketing, but of course it's highly possible that it may contribute to victims reporting. Absolutely, and pretty simple.
So that is. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Councillor.
I'm slightly concerned that yes, men must, well, perpetrators are clearly on the spectrum from someone who maybe can change to someone who truthfully probably isn't going to. And I think it's very important that someone who is, that people, don't feel that it's assumed that they can't be changed, because apart from anything else, that would be very expensive for society. So there isn't very much in this about support groups support, or which can be from presumably quite heavy-handed to make this is going entirely the wrong way to go. That really isn't.
Great point, Councillor, and perhaps I'll refer to myself. We've got much more expertise in this area than mine, but work with perpetrators is an emerging approach to these areas, but it's still in its infancy. I don't know if you've got any experience of that.
Well, I think people can change, especially if you look at the last few years, the stress and the strain that must be been within families over the last few years could tip people into actions which perhaps normally they would never have thought themselves capable of. And I think to deny the approach that you can make positive changes in behaviour, I think could be a very short-sighted one. There are nationally, there is research around where agencies have worked with perpetrators very much to good outcomes, and I think we need to be looking at those approaches in Herefordshire.
So if we have that as a consideration, the recommendation is that that's considered.
There was a little bit about
We
the,
put approaches to perpetrators,
Yeah.
rehabilitation, that something along those lines.
I think that would be very helpful, councillors, actually, because it is still a new concept in
Yeah.
some rural counties. It's quite quite mature in many urban areas, but in rural counties it's still immature, and it could progress that agenda item because, of course,
Yeah.
I do think that, of course, you can't help everybody, but I do think that you can change attitudes and you can change approaches, and as Mandy's quite rightly pointed out, different levels of pressure at different parts of someone's life can affect their behaviours, and I think that, you know, if you look at other nudging and behavioural successes, kick it out in football as an example. The racism was rife 20 or 30 years ago. It's still there, but I definitely think we've made enormous amounts of progress over the last 20 years in that particular agenda because of ensuring that perpetrators of that understand that it's not acceptable behaviour and we can progress and change people's behaviour in those areas. And I know this is a different subject matter, but I think there's the opportunity to do that.
Well, I think it's something that we can just say, you know, and I think we recognise it's not in the plan as it stands, but you know, if it's helpful to you, I think we're happy with that recommendation. Councillor Summers?
Yeah, when it comes to mental abuse, this is probably my field more than anything else, I think. And the problem is with mental abuse, the perpetrator often doesn't know that it's mental abuse or what they're doing. And I think if we're putting something out there that says this is mental abuse, and some of the things that say this is mental abuse, they'll think twice before they do it. They'll say, "Oh, I'm doing that," and it happens, especially with young couples. They're just getting into relationships and stuff. So I think if we could do a list of this is what you're doing, you're a perpetrator, but this is what you're doing, because they don't recognize what they're doing. Anyway, enough from me. Thanks.
No, I think you're completely right, and in a sense that would be the conversation you'd seek to have with schools and colleges and young people, to say you might not think that what you're doing is abuse, but in fact it is, you know, coercive behaviour and emotional blackmail and so on and so forth. Okay, right. We've run out of recommendations now. Okay, crikey, that was a lot of recommendations. And are we?
It's a big subject.
Yes, it's been a very good debate, I think. So we'll content with those recommendations. We could talk back on the screen, I think. Okay. So we'll content and have a proposer and a seconder for the recommendations. Councillor Summers and Councillor Tillett. All in favour, please show. That's unanimous. Thank you very much. Right, so now we're going to move on to the work programme. So an email was sent out to group leaders with regards to the scoping statement that for the task and finish group that was agreed at the last meeting for the impact of the poultry industry on health. So far we've got one volunteer from the Green Group, Councillor Norman, and I'd like to thank her for that. Do I have any volunteers from the committee present today to serve on that task and finish group?
What is it again?
That's the impact on human health of the intensive poultry industry. Okay. So we've got options at this stage that we need to consider, because obviously you need to have a sufficient number of people to make it work, and understand that that members and the wider membership have got other commitments. So we can either simply abandon this as a plan, as a task and finish group, or we can have a time break and go out again to ask for people to join the task and finish group, and see if that with different people having different time commitments will have a different outcome. So in other words, we'll put it on hold to try and still get it lined up, but have it on hold for the time being. Or we can ask for a report from Public Health to cover the areas outlined in the scoping document and not have a task and finish at all. So what are your views on that? My personal view is to hold it and have another ask around the membership, and if that does not generate sufficient interest, then we go to ask the Public Health for a report.
There's a lot of information out there. It's just a matter of putting it together, and that takes time. So I think we would be just going over right now over material that's already there that nobody's reading, and are they going to read? So you got to find some way of putting it together that make people look at it, because it's already there, a lot of it. And I think I mentioned this before, but it's just not happening, is it? For any whatever
So
reason.
of the options that we've got in front of us now,
I think we should definitely look at it, but maybe a later date.
okay. So you still want to look at it, but
Yeah.
at another day. Okay. Councillor Tillett.
Yeah, as long as we're quite specific about the later date, because the later, referring to a later date smacks of kicking into long grass, in which case the public health report might be the better option. But yeah, we can. I don't see there's any harm in putting a limited pause on it and give it another.
Well, I think, to be fair, this will always come back to committee anyway, when we review the work programme every time we meet. So at that point, the committee can say, we've waited long enough, and that's fine. I wouldn't think that we'd want to wait more than the gap between this and the next meeting, really. Until we revisit the discussion next meeting. So if we want to wait on a bit more, we'll wait on a bit more. Yeah, Councillor Marsh?
Yes, I feel things have moved very quickly in the sense since the last meeting with the profile of the intensive livestock industry. We've got our cross-border collection of MPs pushing in a spending pledge. That there's been a lot of publicity in national newspapers. So it's a kind of odd thing that at the moment when we finally got the impetus, or got the go-ahead within the council, and the impetus is really quite strong in the country as a whole, I'm still slightly bemused by the lack of response. So I personally would hope that we would go out, in say by the end of November, because I'm also conscious we really, really want to make sure that it's finished. I don't know how long these things usually go on, but that there is time to finish it in a organised way before we start thinking, blimey, it's nearly the elections. So I hope that we can, I suppose I would be keen to go out fairly soon, because there's such a lot of national publicity, and to kind of go, come on guys, let's just have one more think about whether we can get this afloat when there's such a lot of interest in it.
Just throw something in, perhaps. As far as planning is concerned, planning applications will start to come back in the spring. I would think I don't think we get too many planning applications now in the fall, but in the spring we'll probably start up again. If we had something ready for that would be useful to the planning department, for them to be able to help make decisions on the stuff they get in, that might be. So perhaps. I
don't see this as being informing decisions at planning committee.
It gives them information, though.
It may inform strategic plan making.
Okay.
Potentially. So that's a longer time frame. For instance, it may be that we would say in a supplementary plan document that we think that there should be a specific distance between the receptor and.
But that's what would come in this document, wouldn't it be? Wouldn't
Well,
this,
the purpose of the task and finish, as we scoped it, is to look, you know, at available evidence and.
yeah, but then wouldn't you look
And
at
then
what
we-
you're just saying, the distance, etc., that we need to?
It may be, I don't know, we haven't had the meeting yet, so I don't know what we're going to say.
I know,
Just
I
saying,
understand
but that would
that.
be a for instance, but that would
But
not
that
be
would
something
affect
for the
planning, wouldn't
committee. Well, only subsequent to a policy document.
Okay.
I think what I'm going to say is that unless there's any kind of objection, we're going to put it on hold until the next meeting. I'm going to ask that we communicate once more with the group leaders, maybe put a bit more detail in that communication, and we will hold it in review at that point, and then you know, either continue to wait or ask for the report and wait, or just ask for the report at that meeting. So, okay. So the other task and finish that had been proposed was the issue covering the issue of GP access. I think this is one that Councillor Gandy had suggested. And again, there is a question mark over members' time commitments and whether or not the task and finish is the right way of doing this. It's unfortunate that Councillor Gandy isn't here to put the argument for task and finish. We could, in the alternative, ask for the CCG and or a representative from the primary care network to present at a meeting, or to give us a briefing on the steps they're taking to ensure face-to-face GP access. Christine.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on that particular topic, and I wondered what the thinking was around task and finish being able to achieve in that particular instance. It feels a little bit more like the sort of topic that bringing primary care to present, you know, the challenges that they've got at the moment, and the new Secretary of State announcement around face-to-face, and discuss all of that with the committee might be more beneficial than a task and finish.
Thank you. Any other committee members got a view on this?
I kind of agree with you.
Yeah, I do as well. It's you know, if I'm honest, I can't remember what Carol said 2 months ago to talk, you know, but it is an area of concern. I'm sure that we all get a lot of casework about, or certainly feedback rather than casework, I suppose. And I think actually having one or two of the people here and saying, well, this is the situation and this is what we're trying to do and how we're responding to the new Secretary of State would probably, I think it would take us further forward as well.
A CCG would be better, I think.
Councillor Marsh,
that sounds fine, and there is a slot, isn't there, on the 7th of March, which is a possibility.
Councillor Price, are you content with that? Yep.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll do that then, pencil it in for that vacant. That'd be good. Okay, so now we've got the rest of the work programme to discuss. Review progress against previous recommendation, review the work programme and any necessary updates. So you might have noticed that we were expecting another item today on CHC, but a new policy is being signed off and actioned, and it would be better to schedule this for early next year when it's going to be a better picture and more kind of comprehensive report, which is what we were after. Otherwise, I think it's just going to endlessly be, you know, ping-ponging with it, and that's a bit pointless. It's yet to be confirmed whether we have individual or joint scrutiny of the budget in January, so there may be an opportunity to hear the CHC and GP access then, or the 7th of March, which Councillor Marsh has helpfully pointed out. So has anyone got further comments on the work programme? Councillor Marsh.
last time we did mention for the possibility of some sort of briefing about our contractors and the pressure they may be feeling from a mixture of COVID and there's been a lot of national publicity about staff shortages and rising costs, and I wonder whether it might be possible to provide a briefing for councillors in the next 6 months.
Actually, councillors, that specific issue was also raised at cabinet briefing last Thursday, and a short briefing note for all councillors is being prepared as we speak. So that'll be with you possibly within a week at the latest, I would have thought. But it's because we have currently 17 staff members off with COVID within the community sector. And can't remember the exact number within the care home sector, but it's slightly less than that. But of course, along with all of our in common with all councils in the UK, there is a growing and emerging trend of a shortage of care workers, which we must address as a council, and there is a briefing note on its way to all councils to discuss that issue as we speak.
And also the things about the national insurance and the pay rises, that there are a number, aren't there, of compounding.
It encompasses the recent budget announcements around the minimum wage, 950, and those sorts of issues, etc. And some of the measures that were taken as a council to address some of those concerns, some of the measures that we've taken financially and also operationally to ensure that we have a programme that is being done jointly between operations and commissioning around recruitment and retention that's progressing, but also a recognition that that we have a growing level of economic inactivity within Herefordshire, and we need to put that conundrum together. So we have a need for staff, and we have a large number of individuals that are economically inactive currently, and that's grown quite substantially throughout the pandemic. So we need to try and marry those two together to ensure that we make care of filling an attractive career for people. So that this briefing note will cover those sort of elements.
Thank you. Well, that would seem, if we receive the briefing note, then if you want to pursue that at the next meeting into the work programme, that's fine. But hopefully all the questions will be answered. Thank you. I have a question on the update on. Has anyone got any further things for the work programme that I have a concern over? So just before we go to the votes, I've got a question over the in the update on responses, the carer strategy March 2021, and I might have got confused, but I thought this was going to come to cabinet last week, and then it got bumped because of the children's improvement plan, I assume. But that was suggested that it was kind of quite far advanced, and yet we've got no responses to recommendations. So I think if I could just, ask the question, what's going on with that, maybe, with recommendations. That's we could just ask that. So it might be that they're just being slightly dislocated somehow. That would be great. Okay, so we now note the updated recommendation tracker in Appendix 1. And we've reviewed the work programme of Appendix 2. Discussed any additional items, yes. And approve the scoping document Appendix 3 for the task and finish group on the health impacts of the intensive poultry industry, its membership, which we can't do. So we'll have to, we just take that recommendation out?
Yes.
We'll change that recommendation to we're going to sit next meeting.
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
Discuss with you before the meeting. I know I'm not sure how to go about it. When you're talking, is the communications between elderly people on getting paperwork done and getting stuff through all the red tape that's available. I've had a couple of instances where, with a little bit of help from talking to you, we've got some good stuff gone on, but it's too infrequent. So I'm not sure how we can sort that one out. It's just a matter of the communications between caring staff or officers or employers when somebody calls up about getting something done as far as their caring is concerned, if they want to care for themselves or whether they want to go in, they seem to need more help. And when they get to a certain age, it's getting very difficult for them to get their heads around stuff. And I'm not sure if there's anything we can do as far as the committee is concerned in that regard. If Paul has any suggestions, I would be happy to hear. If Chair has suggestions, I would be happy to hear. But I think there is a problem out there about communications on what to do when you go either in a care home or stay home, or what you have to do to get this and get that and everything else. It's almost a minefield from what I'm finding out. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Summers. Maybe if we could maybe look at doing something around talk community when there's an appropriate moment to do that.
Absolutely, Councillor. I'm not quite understanding the ask. So is it communication and information around statutory services and assessments and that,
Yeah.
or is it talk community? I'm not sure what the ask is.
It's statutory. Something that I sent you an email, or you've been involved in an email with a particular person. I won't go into the details of it, but it took a while to get to where we are now. But now she's really, really happy, and the reason she's really, really happy, I left it in Amy's lap, and she got onto it, and they took care of it, and it's all slid through. But before, and this woman is pretty smart, she couldn't get around it. She was getting every which way she went. She was hitting brick walls. When it started to work, it worked, and she's really happy with it now. And I sent her the email, and Amy's going to send it to the people involved. But it took a lot of work to get there, and I had to get involved to get there, which is not a big problem. I did get involved, but we need to have know what's good. Perhaps we need to know what happens when somebody phones and say, "I'm 75 years old, 80 years old. What's my next move? What paperwork do I have to do? Is there any benefits there for me? Or I have this amount of money, blah, blah, blah." You know what I mean? Just, it's to make it easier.
Would this be described as the role of the community broker?
Well, I think it depends on the information people are looking for. The usual point of contact for coming in for anything from access to debt advice, aids and adaptations, financial assessment would be through the advice and referral line, which would be ART basically. We've got people trained up to provide exactly that kind of safeguarding advice, but without knowing the circumstances, whether there are people that perhaps wouldn't think of that adult social care line, but may want something quite different, where a community broker and community hub or good neighbours.
Maybe it is community broker that we're talking about, but at the end of the day, elderly people, I know my mother, she's not here any longer, but just to do a blue badge was difficult, and then they just keep sending it back to you without, you haven't filled this in, send it back. So it needs somebody, and I know it's extra work and it's extra money, but we need somebody that's there so they can say, okay, I can help you with this, whether it's over the phone or something. But we need, if we go take it by how this one worked out, it worked out great. If we get more advertising like that, it'd be wonderful. It's just that more and more I've got somebody else in Travelers area that having problems. So yeah, we need to find some way of taking care of our elderly in a way that, I don't know how you can do it, but there is a gap there somewhere. But
Councillor Summers, can I request that you have a specific conversation with Mrs. Appleby, because each case will be slightly different.
Oh, I understand that.
And our ability and our current offer is pretty exemplary, I have to say. We're in an incredibly robust and strong position as a council, based on the satisfaction levels that we evidence. And of course, we have strengths-based approaches, and we really do have a very visible contact approach from the council. So it could well be that there's an individual case that we need to talk about, and I know that you've cited me on a specific case, and the outcome was thankfully very positive. But I think that's discussion with Mrs. Appleby, I think, will be quite useful, because there is a very visible pathway and a very visible line of communication within Herefordshire. So perhaps we just need to make that.
So just to assure people, community brokers are sat with our customer service. So if a community broker needs to, then we'll be sort of alerted to any cases where we need to connect people to resources in the community, and they're there just to do that. So
Okay, before going else with the committee, can I have this lady contact, or you can contact her, I'll get her permission. And she's got things pretty well on the ball. If you read her emails alone, you'll see that she's not a stupid woman, but she found it very difficult until we got involved in it. Okay, so that might give you a better idea of what we need to do as a council, because I think it is an issue. I know we have everything in place, but it's not working. Maybe if you talk to her, you might find out why. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd be delighted to.
Okay, thank you, Chair, for letting me go on.
Councillor, thank you for bringing that to our attention. That's great. And it actually does remind me that one thing that I keep trying to get on somewhere in how we do things is that we have voice of service user briefing or something, that we have a way of engaging directly with service users or those who work directly with service users. I just think in terms of, without any particular scrutiny in mind, but just so we can listen to them, and then something may come from that, or it certainly will help us learn more about what it is that we're doing and how to look at it from different perspectives. So I put that out as an ask, and if anyone can facilitate that as a briefing or a session or a virtual session or something, that would be really, really welcome. Thank you. So I think that's it on the work programme for us. Is everyone content with the work programme? We just have a show of hands. Thank you. Good with that. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the end of the agenda. Date of the next meeting. The date of the next meeting is Monday, the 10th of January 2022 at 2:30. And I'm formally closing this meeting.